I'm Brian Schmidt. I'm a composer, sound designer, and music technologist in the game industry. So kind of ranges the gamut from designing sound systems to writing music to run on those sound systems. Yes, I started in pinball. I actually fell into game audio. I was finishing my master's degree at Northwestern University, and a friend of mine had word that that a company called Williams Electronics Games, which makes pinball machines, was looking for somebody who could write music, do sound effects, and also write 6800 assembly language. So I pretended that I knew how to do that, and went in for the interview, sort of as I was finishing school. And actually, as I was finishing up the interview, they brought me back into a back room and they showed me an unreleased pinball machine, F-14 Tomcat. And I was always a huge pinball fan. My mom used to get mad at me for wasting all my quarters in middle school playing pinball, and we'd go to Florida and I'd spend the whole vacation in the basement of the hotel playing pinball. So I was pretty good. And later I found out that one of the reasons I got the job was because I was a really good pinball player, which makes sense now that I think about it, because when you're working on games, the people who are making those games want people who are doing the sounds for those games to really love the games that they're working on. So it definitely helps to play games. The very first one, I was doing some sound design for a game called Fire. Chris Granner did the music for that game. And I was coming in kind of at the tail end, so I did a bunch of sort of ancillary sounds, one of which, some breaking glass sounds, some miscellaneous sound effects, and recording speech in an incredibly primitive speech system. The fidelity was really, really atrocious. But I think I recorded somebody saying, "Break a window," and, "Fire, fire," or something like that.
What year was this?
1987. So things were a little more primitive back then. For pinball machines, it was actually kind of interesting. It was not too dissimilar from what we learned kind of in academic computer music. We had these, we didn't use MIDI, we didn't go into studios and record real instruments. It was all synthesizer based. So at the time, Williams had just started using this new technology called FM synthesis, which Yamaha put into a chip, the 2151 chip, which could play 8 voices of 4 operator FM, which was kind of the baby brother of the DX7 chip. I think that chip was in the DX9. And Bill Prod and Chris Granner had written this custom pinball sound operating system, all in assembly language, that took as an input a text file that you would specify every note and duration and volume and so on, and what patch it was going to play. And we used to generally write music out on paper. That's how I composed. And after I finished composing it in music paper, I just enter it in note by note into this sort of text file format that would then get compiled into some code that would be put into the game. But it had some really big advantages over even kind of the stuff that we do now, in that it allowed the music to be much more interactive and flow a lot more tightly to what was going on in the game. So even though the sounds themselves were pretty primitive, the interactivity was really, really pretty good. One of the advantages to sort of having your own sound system that that has been written from scratch is that if there's a new feature you want to add to it, we would just write some code and now the system could do that. But it also kind of brought home to me the importance not only of having a system that can do it, but really having buy-off from the whole team about wanting to do really deep interactive audio. One of my favorite games to work on was a game called Black Knight 2000, which the famous pinball designer Steve Ritchie designed. And the interactivity that we had in that was really pretty remarkable, I think, especially considering it was 1988. We had a system where pretty much once you put the quarter in and hit start, the music started and never ever lost a beat until the game was over. Every single thing occurring was in time with the music. The musical transitions, because we're all in sync with the beat. Pinballs are actually pretty complicated. People don't realize that a typical pinball machine then and now probably has a good 25 minutes of original score in it. There are all these sort of different game states the game gets into. Sometimes you're in a state where it's really, really tense and you got to make this one shot. Maybe when you've just made the jackpot, it's very celebratory. So we have all these different kinds of musical states we need to be in. And our system could be playing a piece of music, and then the player makes a shot, and now we're in a different state. Like, oh, multi-ball starts, and it's time to get all frenetic and crazy. Well, we would have had a system where we would then wait for a beat or measure or 2-beat boundary, and then have a small transition piece that would take us to that new piece.
No way. No way.
So while this is all happening, we always obviously have all these sound effects and things going on as the balls are flying around and hitting things. And our system would actually let us do things like quantize the sound effects to musical boundaries. So in Black Knight 2000, for example, I think the pop bumpers are all quantized to the 16th note. So whenever the ball's in the pop bumpers, it sounds like somebody's doing a crazy tom-tom solo. We also were able to have the sound effects understand the key of the music that was playing underneath. So at any given time, if there was a sound effect that maybe had a musical component to it, had a pitch to it, if the music were playing an E minor chord underneath, the sound effect would be in E minor. And in fact, if the music were in E minor, then the sound effect started playing, then the chord would change, let's say to B or C in the middle of the sound effect would transpose itself instantly down to that thing to match it. So we did a lot of those sorts of things, and we could do that because we had this very tight system where we were generating the music on the fly. The other thing that was fun about Black Knight 2000, which again gets back to the team getting buy-off on all this stuff, I had a huge advantage that the game designer, Steve Ritchie, who was also a guitar player and a musician, and the programmer, Ed Boon, who went on to create Mortal Kombat, really, really thought audio was very, very important. And we had a series of signals we could put in the music for when important accents happen, important beats happen. And so all the playfield flashlights, the flashing lights and the bright lights that go off on the playfield would sit there waiting for the music to tell them when to fire off. So I could, in the musical score, control the playfield lights. And then the last thing that was really nice about Black Knight is that they thought the music interactivity was so important. They would actually have places where let's say the ball drains, and now you go to showing your bonus score, or go on to the next ball, the game would actually pause for a musical boundary to occur before it put up the bonus score, or before it would kick out the next ball. And when it kicked out the next ball, it would do it on beat one of a measure. So that kind of, the game actually sitting there waiting for the music to do something so that the whole game felt very synchronized was very important. And that really only happens when you have buy-off from game designer, game programmer, and then the system can actually support that. So that game was very fun in that sense. And pinballs, again, are very, very dynamic, very interactive. I'd like to think of pinball as the original casual game. So we just had this bunch of gameplay that happened, and all, again, changing game states. So we had different pieces of music, and we just kind of made it up. It's like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we did this? Or wouldn't it be cool if, is there some way we can make it so that I can control the flashlights, the flashing lamps, because I know when the musical accents are, and that way you don't have to reprogram them if I change the music. And Ed was like, yeah, I can do that. We can do that. So it was just this iterative process over the years of building up the system to enable the capabilities, and then having some custom tools that we wrote to allow us to take advantage of it. Obviously, originally pinball, it's that ting, 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 which literally was an electromagnet, firing off and hitting these little metal bars. That's the original pinball chimes. Actually, as a pinball sound designer, it's rather annoying because when sometimes you'll be watching a TV show and you'll see a game you worked on, on the TV show, and somebody will be playing it, and instead of the actual sounds that you did for that pinball machine, some sound editor has dubbed in ding, 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 even though it's a game from 2009 or something like that. So that's our little pet peeve there. But then back then, games themselves were electromechanical. Then in the early 80s, pinballs went solid state, where now they were being controlled by microprocessors. And at that point, you started having little, they didn't have special sound chips. What they were just a little general purpose processor that some very, very smart people wrote code for. In about 4 kilobytes of data, they came up with these cool algorithms to make noise. And a lot of these sounds were in games like Defender and Robotron and Stargate and whatnot. This sort of and these are all purely synthesized sounds. There's no wave files of any of that stuff. And so those sounds which were done for those video games made it into the pinball machines. Again, that was done by the same people, same systems. And then the big turn for pinball music and sound was 1986, I think. It was a game called Road Kings. And that was the first pinball machine to use the Yamaha FM synthesis chip. And at that point, again, we had 8-voice polyphony. We could actually do music that was more, actual music, where you'd write it down on paper and so on. And that's following actually the first arcade game that did it, which was done by Atari, I believe, arcade game called Marble Madness. So that was the first arcade game with FM synthesis, and then pinball was from there. The next bit of innovation was, I had left Williams by then, and I was doing consulting for a company called Data East, which later became Sega Pinball. And instead of using FM synthesis, we went to sampled synthesis. And that used a chip called the BSMT 2000 that I actually created mostly for Sega. That BS is me. So the BSMT 2000 was a sample playback chip we designed specifically for pinball machines and arcade games. And it kind of replaced the FM chip in that it let us use sampled instruments instead of FM instruments. So that was kind of the standard there for a few years. Williams was still doing FM synthesis, and Data East, Sega, had moved to sampled sounds. Then the next innovation was, I don't recall the year, but the pinball machine was Indiana Jones by Williams, and that used a new system they had been working on called DCS, which stands for Digital Compression System. This was before MP3 or Ogg Vorbis or any of this stuff existed. And it used technique similar to how MP3 works or Ogg Vorbis works. And then that allowed them to record music in a studio, and then shrink it down. One of the big gating factors for sound in pinball machines was how much memory do we have, can we store in the physical pinball machine itself. And in those days it was measured in hundreds of kilobytes. So a game might have 256 kilobytes of sound data, or a half megabyte of sound data. That's a half megabyte, not a half gigabyte, half megabyte of sound data. And so being able to cram a lot of sound into a small space is very important. I think that's one of the reasons that synthesized sounds lasted as long as they did. If all you have to do is store the score, then you can have a whole lot of music. But if you have to store the sounds themselves, now you can't get as much sound in. The other challenge, of course, when you go to pre-recorded sounds is you lose some of that interactivity. You can't have your sound effects retranspose themselves to the key of the music because they're just recorded WAV files. And then sometime after that, I don't recall exactly when, pinball machines pretty much just went to using sampled sounds for everything. Memory got a lot cheaper, so you could go have a couple of gigabytes of data for sound for pinball machines. So that's kind of the history from ding, 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 up through today's scores, which are just done in a studio and like any other soundtrack would be. Yeah, the Guns N' Roses game was very fun. This was it was either a Data, East, or a Sega game, I don't recall which. And they did the license with Guns N' Roses. So it turns out Slash is a really huge pinball fan. He's got pinball machines at his house, he plays a lot. So he was actually very excited to work with us. We spent a lot of time collaborating on this game. We started by going into the studio, I believe it was the record plant down in LA, and blowing the dust off the old 2-inch 24-track tapes from the old Guns N' Roses albums. And I wanted to make the music really interactive. I didn't want it just to be, play a minute of Guns N' Roses music in the background while you're playing pinball, because I'm thinking back to Black Knight 2000 and the interactivity we had with that. So I went in and stripped every track individually on DAT. So I had, just Slash lead, just Slash rhythm, just Duff playing bass, just drums, just vocal 1, just vocal 2, and so on. And then I actually brought it back to my studio, and for bass and drums, I actually recorded individual notes. So I would take, a bass guitar E, a bass guitar A, a bass guitar D, because this was still on the BSMT chip, the sample playback chip. And then I would take sort of measure or 2 or 3 or 4 measure long snippets of guitar or vocals. And then as the game, so I could essentially reassemble the music bit by bit. And because I had it broken into fairly small bits, and because bass and drums were essentially just the equivalent of little MIDI sequences, I could make the music kind of ebb and flow. I could take the vocals out, I could put it back in, I could take the drums out for a time, put them back in. I could create a new drum part to an existing guitar part, and so it really added a lot of sort of extra stuff that we had there and let it be a lot more interactive. And it turns out we found on those tapes a half-made song called Ain't Going Down, which they had never finished recording and never released. And so we decided to kind of finish it off and put it into the pinball machine. And so there's this mode that you can get in, and you'll hear this song that, to my knowledge, has only ever been released, a Guns N' Roses song that was only ever released in the pinball machine. So that was a lot of fun.
Were they aware that you were going to be using that track?
Slash was there with us while we were doing it. So we had a lot of meetings with Slash where he was pretty hands-on. Like I said, he cares about his music passionately. He's also one of the most polite people you've ever met, which was very surprising. It's not the persona you get from him with the top hat and the cigarette, but he's very, very good to work with, very professional. He cared a lot about the music, obviously, and he also cared about the implementation of the pinball machine.
Well, for one, okay, there hasn't been a cool pinball machine in the last 11 years as far as rock and roll is concerned. Like, I think the last one, not to plug Ted Nugent, but it was Weekend Warriors. Anyway, so when we decided to do one, it had to be something really cool and different and exciting. And so the Guns N' Roses machine is the loudest one ever made, so there you have it. the funny thing about it is that the whole object of the game, if you know any history of Guns N' Roses, is to get the band on stage, right? So you go through all 6 members, which is this shot right here, all right? Every time you make this shot, you get another band member. If you get all 6 of them, the band is officially on stage, and all 6 balls come out, and then you get to play a 6-ball game, all right? And that's got a certain personal humor for me, all right? Because we're notorious for not getting on stage on time. So initially, when we started designing this game on the napkin, it was drawn out with a basic goal, which was the G and the R ramps, and that's where it started. And so here they are. To be able to establish the fact that it is what it is really important. And it's nice to have a real official rock and roll machine that has our name on it, you know, so I'm happy.
Yeah, the last game I did, which was for Sega Pinball, was somewhere in the late 90s, 97 or 98 or something like that, before I was at Microsoft. And just not that recently, I got a call from the folks at Stern saying, hey, how'd you like to do pinball with sound again? And I was like, wow, that would be a blast. So I've started doing some work for them. I'm actually working on a game with Steve Ritchie again, who was the designer for Black Knight 2000. I'm really psyched about that. Unfortunately, I can't tell you the name of the game because it's a amazingly fun licensed title. But I just finished doing a bunch of sound design on the Walking Dead pinball for Stern. They're just coming out with a Kiss pinball that I helped add some cool stuff to their sound system for that one. I didn't do the sound design or music on that one, but it's now pinball machines need some digital signal processing on them, so I put some of that stuff in, and I'm just psyched to be working with Steve again on this game coming up.
Great. So how has sound and pinball changed then from 1999 to now?
Again, the biggest change is that it's really, music has been replaced by completely pre-recorded music. It's, we don't have little synthesizer chips anymore, which allows us to get really great fidelity and, really great production value. The game I'm working on, it's a big orchestral feel and lots of cool battles and things like that. So we'll be able to just use, I'm not going to have to squeeze it down to FM synthesis chips or, sample playback chips that are trying to make decent string sounds. I'll just, use string libraries and hire some live players. So that's the biggest change probably. Some of the display technology has gotten a lot better, so we're doing synchronization of some of the display effects, and putting sound to those is not that different than putting sound to linear picture.